presence. It presses against your skin, seeps into your bones, and fills your lungs with an air so sharp it feels like breathing shattered glass. This is the high Arctic, a world that most humans will never see, never feel, and never truly understand. But for the Inuit people, this frozen frontier is not a hostile wilderness. It is home. It is a library written in snow and wind. It is a clock set to the rhythm of stars. And for thousands of years, they have read it perfectly. Then something changed. Not gradually, the way textbooks describe climate shifts over centuries. Not in the abstract language of scientific papers and government reports. It changed the way a trusted friend suddenly says something that makes no sense, abruptly, personally, and in a way that shakes something deep inside you. The Inuit elders, men and women, who had spent entire lifetimes mastering the language of the Arctic environment, began noticing things that should have been impossible. The sun was appearing in places it had never appeared before. Stars that had guided hunters home for countless generations seemed to have quietly relocated overnight. The wind, which they had always read like a compass, was blowing from directions that contradicted everything their ancestors had taught them. When these observations were first reported to the outside world, scientists were skeptical. After all, the instruments were clear. Nothing had shifted. The Earth's axis was stable. The North Pole had not moved. But the elders were insistent, and they were not people who spoke carelessly about the sky. So the researchers kept listening, and what they eventually discovered shook the scientific community in ways that no one had anticipated. Because the elders were not wrong. They were witnessing something real, something extraordinary, something that the most sophisticated technology on the planet had initially failed to detect. This is that story. To understand why the observations of Inuit elders carry such extraordinary scientific weight, you first have to understand who these people are and what kind of knowledge they carry. The Inuit have inhabited the Arctic for roughly 5,000 years. That is not just a long time in human terms. It is an almost incomprehensible span of continuous, intimate, survival-level relationship with one of the harshest environments on the planet. In that environment, being wrong about nature is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence. A hunter who misreads the condition of sea ice does not come home. A family that misjudges the weather does not survive the night. A community that loses track of the seasonal cycles loses its ability to hunt, to fish, to store food, and ultimately to exist. This is why, over 50 centuries, the Inuit developed what researchers today call traditional ecological knowledge, a system of environmental literacy so precise, so detailed, and so deeply embedded in daily life that it functions almost like a second nervous system. Their navigation system, for instance, does not rely on compasses or maps. Instead, Inuit hunters read the landscape itself. They study the sastrugi, the wave-shaped ridges carved into the snow by prevailing winds, to determine direction even in total whiteout conditions. They feel the texture of the snow through their boot soles and sled runners. They read the color of ice to determine its thickness and safety. They track cloud formations, animal behaviors, and subtle shifts in air temperature to predict weather days in advance. And above all, they read the sky, the position of the sun during the months of light, and the architecture of the stars during the long polar night, with a precision that leaves researchers stunned. When you understand all of this, you understand why. When Inuit elders say the sun has moved, the statement cannot be dismissed. These are not casual observers making an offhand comment. These are the human equivalent of precision instruments, calibrated by generations of life-or-death observation, reading a system they have monitored continuously for 5,000 years. So when multiple elders across different communities, separated by distance, but united in their observations, began saying the same thing, the scientific world had no choice but to pay attention. The reports began circulating seriously in the early years of the 21st century, though elders suggest they had been noticing changes for some time before that. The specific observations varied in detail from community to community, but the essential message was consistent and deeply unsettling. The sun was rising in the wrong position. In the Arctic communities of Canada's Nunavut territory, elders described the sunrise appearing noticeably shifted from where it had always been. This matters enormously in the Arctic, because the return of the sun after months of polar darkness is one of the most significant events in the annual cycle. Communities have marked, for generations, the exact geographic notch, a specific gap in a mountain ridge, a particular point on the horizon, where the first sliver of sunlight reappears after the long winter night. These markers are not casual observations. They are the equivalent of sacred astronomical records, passed down and verified across generations. One elder described the sun returning to a position that was visually displaced by what he estimated to be roughly 19 kilometers from where it had appeared throughout his youth. Now, to someone living in a city, 19 kilometers of positional difference might sound minor, but in the mathematics of Arctic navigation, that displacement translates to a significant angular shift relative to the observer. For hunters who set out across vast stretches of featureless sea ice using celestial cues as their primary guidance system, that kind of shift is not a curiosity. It is a crisis. The sun, elders also reported, was staying above the horizon longer than their ancestral knowledge predicted, not by minutes, but by stretches of time significant enough to be noticed by people whose biological clocks are finely tuned to the patterns of Arctic light. The quality of the sunlight itself felt different, more intense, more direct, as though some layer of protection in the atmosphere above them had thinned. And then there were the stars. During the polar night, when the sun disappears entirely for weeks or months, the stars become the only navigational reference available. Inuit hunters have named specific constellations and used their positions and movements to guide night travel across the sea ice. Orion's belt, known in Inuktitut as Uliktut, is one such critical marker. But hunters began reporting that familiar constellations appeared to have shifted, appearing higher in the sky or further to one side than they should have been according to knowledge that had been reliable for centuries. When a hunter follows a star that has moved without his knowledge, he does not simply get lost. He walks in the wrong direction, possibly toward open water, toward a crack in the ice, toward a lead that should not be there. Several near-fatal incidents were reported by hunters who had trusted their traditional celestial navigation and ended up dangerously close to the open ocean. The stakes of this phenomenon, in other words, were not abstract. They were measured in human lives. When news of these observations reached the broader scientific community, the reaction was complicated. On one hand, researchers who had spent time in Arctic communities knew better than to dismiss indigenous observations reflexively. On the other hand, the claim seemed physically impossible. The Earth's axial tilt, that famous 23.5-degree lean that gives our planet its seasons, is one of the most carefully monitored measurements in modern science. Global networks of stations using very long baseline interferometry, combined with GPS satellite systems capable of detecting positional changes of just a few millimeters, were continuously tracking the planet's orientation. These systems showed nothing. The axis was stable. The North Pole was where it had always been. From a physics standpoint, the kind of tilt the elders were describing, one significant enough to visibly shift the sunrise position or extend the polar day by a noticeable duration, would have been catastrophic on a global scale. Such a shift would have triggered massive geological upheaval, disrupted ocean circulation patterns, and rendered every satellite navigation system on Earth unreliable almost instantly. None of that had happened. The instruments were unanimous, and yet the elders remained firm. They were not describing a theory. They were reporting direct sensory experience. The sun on their skin, the stars in their eyes, the shadows falling at wrong angles across terrain they had known their entire lives. These were not people prone to exaggeration or confusion about the environment that defined their existence. So scientists did something important. Instead of dismissing the elders or blindly accepting a physical impossibility, they asked a different question. If the Earth had not moved, why was the sun appearing to move? What could cause an entire civilization's worth of experienced observers to consistently perceive a shift that the instruments were not recording? The answer, when it finally emerged, was not only scientifically fascinating, it was deeply alarming, because it pointed to something that the satellites had genuinely missed. Not because the satellites were wrong, but because they were looking at the wrong thing entirely. The explanation lies in an optical phenomenon with an evocative name, the Novaya Zemlya effect, named after the Russian Arctic archipelago, where European explorers first documented it centuries ago. This effect describes what happens when extreme atmospheric conditions cause light to travel not in a straight line, but in a curve that follows the surface of the Earth. Under normal atmospheric conditions, temperature drops as altitude increases. Light passes through the atmosphere in essentially straight lines, and what you see on the horizon is what is actually there. But in a rapidly warming Arctic, something different is happening. As the region heats at a rate approximately 4 times faster than the global average, a specific set of atmospheric conditions has become far more common: thermal inversions. A thermal inversion occurs when a layer of unusually warm air becomes trapped above a layer of colder, denser air near the surface. This creates what physicists describe as a sharp boundary of differing air densities. When light, including sunlight, hits this boundary, it does not pass through cleanly. Instead, it bends, it refracts, and in the extreme cases produced by Arctic thermal inversions, the bending is so pronounced that light can actually curve around the horizon, carrying the image of the sun from a position that is still below the curve of the Earth and projecting it into the visible sky above the horizon. What the Inuit elders were seeing, in some cases, was not the actual sun. They were seeing a projected image, a kind of atmospheric phantom, of the sun appearing in the sky, while the real sun was still hidden beyond the horizon. This phantom sun can appear distorted, flattened, stretched into a rectangular band, or stacked into multiple shimmering layers. It can appear earlier than the actual sunrise, in a location that does not correspond to where the sun would actually rise, and it can behave in ways that seem to violate the celestial patterns that experienced observers have memorized. The same effect can distort the apparent positions of the moon and stars, bending their light through the increasingly stratified Arctic atmosphere and shifting their perceived positions by degrees. For hunters navigating by specific star positions, a shift of even a few degrees can be enough to send them dangerously off course. What makes this discovery so significant and so deeply unsettling is that the growing frequency and intensity of this phenomenon is itself a direct consequence of climate change. As Arctic sea ice retreats, the dark ocean beneath absorbs far more solar energy than the reflective ice did. This accelerates warming, increases the frequency and persistence of thermal inversion layers, and steadily amplifies the atmospheric distortion effects. The Inuit elders were not misinterpreting a stable environment. They were accurately observing an environment that was genuinely changing. They were just misidentifying the mechanism, which is entirely understandable given that the actual mechanism involves atmospheric physics that even most professional meteorologists would find counterintuitive. The scientists who eventually pieced this together reached a striking conclusion. The elders had not been wrong. They had been measuring something real. The apparent position of the sun had changed because the atmosphere through which they observed it had changed. The Inuit were not confused observers. They were precise instruments detecting a new signal in a system they knew better than anyone alive. There was, however, another layer to this story, one that gave the elders broader intuition and unexpected and even more remarkable validation. While the shifted sun could be explained by atmospheric optics, scientists investigating the elders' reports simultaneously uncovered something that could not be explained that way. The Earth was experiencing a measurable physical shift in the location of its geographic North Pole. For decades, the geographic North Pole has drifted slowly, a natural phenomenon driven by internal geological processes. But around the beginning of the 21st century, something changed. The drift accelerated, and its direction shifted dramatically. Using data from the GRACE satellite mission, twin satellites that mapped variations in Earth's gravitational field with extraordinary precision, researchers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory identified the primary driver of this new behavior: the massive, accelerating loss of ice from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. When billions of tons of ice melt and flow into the ocean, the distribution of mass across the planet changes. The planet, like any spinning object, adjusts its rotation in response to redistributions of its own mass. This is the same principle that causes a figure skater to spin faster when she pulls her arms inward, or slower when she extends them. As the ice sheets shrink, their mass, formerly concentrated near the poles, spreads across the global ocean. This redistribution nudges the Earth's rotational axis, causing a physical shift in the position of the geographic North Pole that is measurable in real, physical space. This process is called polar motion, and the rate at which it was occurring had measurably changed. The North Pole was moving, not dramatically, not in ways visible to the human eye without instruments, but genuinely, physically moving in response to the planetary scale redistribution of water. Separately, the magnetic North Pole, the point to which compass needles point, had also been accelerating its drift, moving from the Canadian Arctic toward Siberia at roughly 55 kilometers per year. This phenomenon, driven by changes in Earth's outer liquid core, was disrupting the traditional relationship between the high Arctic environment and the global magnetic field, adding yet another layer of disorientation to the world the Inuit navigated. The elders, it turned out, were sensing a planet in genuine physical transition. Their instinct that something fundamental had shifted was not a misinterpretation of atmospheric phenomena. It was a correct reading of a deeply unstable Earth, one whose surface appearance, atmosphere behavior, and even rotational dynamics were all simultaneously changing in response to the same underlying cause, a rapidly warming climate. The scientific explanations, as elegant as they are, do not fully capture what this transformation means for the people living through it. Science can describe the Novaya Zemlya effect in equations. It cannot fully measure what it means for a 5,000-year-old knowledge system to stop working. The Inuit language, Inuktitut, contains dozens of words for ice and snow conditions that have no English equivalent. Not because Inuit culture is exotic, but because precise distinctions between ice types are survival-critical information in that world. Their vocabulary for environmental observation reflects a granularity of attention that most people cannot even conceive of. When elders say the wind has changed its character, they do not mean it is coming from a slightly different compass point. They mean the entire behavioral signature of the wind, its texture, its persistence, the way it sculpts the snow, has become unrecognizable against the backdrop of everything they have ever been taught. The psychological dimension of this is what researchers have begun calling solastalgia, a form of distress that arises not from leaving home, but from watching home transform around you until it is unrecognizable while you are still standing in it. It is homesickness without the ability to leave, because the thing that is left is not you, but the place itself. Elders who had confidently taught young hunters to read the sky for decades began to hesitate. The concern was not abstract. If the knowledge they had inherited was no longer reliable, if the stars led hunters toward open water instead of home, then teaching that knowledge uncritically could be more dangerous than not teaching it at all. The result has been a growing silence in the transmission of traditional knowledge, a 5,000-year chain of survival information, fraying at the point of greatest need. Scientists who spent extended time in these communities described an atmosphere of profound unease. Not panic, but something quieter and more enduring. The sensation of standing in a landscape that looks familiar but behaves like a stranger. The vertigo of living in a world whose rules have changed without announcement or explanation. There's a deeper lesson buried in this story, one that extends far beyond the Arctic and far beyond the specific phenomena of atmospheric optics and polar motion. It is a lesson about the nature of observation, the limits of instruments, and the intelligence embedded in long-term human knowledge. Western science operates primarily through sensors and snapshots, data collected at specific moments, from specific locations, by specific instruments. This approach is extraordinarily powerful and has produced human civilization's most reliable body of knowledge. But it has a structural limitation. It can only detect what it is designed to detect, and it can only raise alarms about changes it is calibrated to notice. When the Arctic atmosphere began bending light in new ways, the global satellite network did not flag an emergency because bending light in the Arctic sky was not what it was monitoring. It was looking at the Earth's axis, the magnetic field, the ice sheet volume, not at the refractive index of air near the surface of the polar ocean. The Inuit, however, were monitoring everything, continuously, with a measurement system that had no gaps in its data record across 50 centuries. They were not looking for a specific variable. They were reading a whole system, the integrated, simultaneous behavior of sun, stars, wind, ice, shadow, and light, and they noticed when the harmony of that system broke down, even before they could name what had broken. This is what traditional ecological knowledge offers that no instrument array currently can. A holistic, real-time, integrated reading of environmental systems as they are actually experienced. It does not replace scientific measurement, but it can detect things that scientific measurement misses, and it can do so across timescales, generations of continuous observation, that no satellite program has yet matched. The Arctic case made this undeniable. The elders screamed first. The instruments caught up later, and when they did, they confirmed that the elders had been right, not in their interpretation of the mechanism, but in their fundamental observation that the world had changed. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. The horizon was lying. The story of the Inuit elders and the shifting sun is, at its deepest level, a story about what happens when we alter something so fundamental, the chemistry and thermal behavior of the atmosphere, that even light itself stops telling the truth. The photons that enter an Inuit elder's eye on a January morning in Nunavut have traveled 93 million miles from the sun. In that journey, they have crossed the vacuum of space without interference. But in the last few miles, the few kilometers of atmosphere between the top of the sky and the surface of the ice, they now travel through air that has been chemically and physically altered by 2 centuries of industrial activity. The temperature gradients are different. The density layers are different. The path of the light is different. And so what arrives at the human eye is not what used to arrive. The image is bent. The sun appears where it should not. The stars seem to have moved. This is not a metaphor. This is physics, and it means that we have changed the earth so profoundly that the most ancient form of information technology available to human beings, the direct perception of light, the original navigation system that our species relied on long before written language or metal tools, has been compromised in one of the most remote corners of the planet. The Inuit elders did not need to understand atmospheric optics to know something was wrong. They did not need to read scientific papers about polar motion or thermal inversions. They needed only their eyes, their skin, their inherited memory, and their willingness to say out loud what they were seeing, even when the outside world told them they must be mistaken. They were not mistaken. They were the first witnesses to a new kind of world, a world where the sky itself had become unreliable, where the most constant things had become strangers, and where a civilization's entire navigational inheritance had been rendered dangerous by a phenomenon too large and too diffuse for conventional instruments to see. We would do well to keep listening to them, because the Arctic, as it has always been, is not just a place at the edge of the world. It is a mirror showing the rest of the world what is coming next. And right now, the reflection is not a comfortable one.